Thanks very much. And I have to say, it is fantastic to be here in such an international event with so many diverse perspectives. Going to bring up the slides, hopefully, and to tell you a little bit about our 12th digital news report. And our report covers 46 different markets and 93 different respondents to our survey, and that represents about half the world's population. Just before I start, a reminder about the methodology. So this survey is based on online polling, so it is going to tend to slightly underrepresent traditional news behaviors, such as television, print, and radio, especially when we talk about cross-platform behavior. And it's also important to stress that some of the markets here, particularly the ones in Africa, also actually in India, are representative of younger, more educated English-speaking groups. So that's really important to bear in mind. We try not to compare directly those markets with some of the markets in Northern Europe, for example. And the survey was conducted on our behalf by YouGov, a market research agency, in early January, February this year. As you can see, the report is supported by a number of different organizations, 18 different organizations, including a big grant from the Google News Initiative. We have the BBC, NHK, media regulators, industry organizations, and academic institutions around the world as well. And supporting our work in Africa for the first time, we have Code for Africa, and grateful to Fundación Gabo for helping with the Spanish translation. Now, one of the key themes that comes out of this year's data across countries is the fraying connection between news organizations and audiences, and particularly some audiences. And one of the sort of clearest illustrations of this is the question we ask about how do you get to news? Where do you start your news journeys? Do you start going directly to a news website or app? Do you start with social media or with search or with aggregators? And what this chart shows is since 2018, averaged across all 46 countries, you can see direct access in the blue has fallen from 32% preference to 22%. And social media preference has grown consistently, relentlessly. We haven't seen so much change with some of the other gateways. Search, of course, is absolutely critical in bringing traffic to journalism, plays a major role along with aggregators and news alerts. These are averages, but it's really important to stress that, as we've heard in this conference, that the market situation in different countries is incredibly different. So if you look at some of the countries in Northern Europe here, you see there's still a large proportion of people who go directly. Those direct connections still exist. But if you look at many markets in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, we can see that far fewer people say that they start their journeys directly, just a very small percentage, and far more people are just by default going in through social media because of the convenience of social media. 64% in Thailand, 53% in the Philippines, and that obviously shapes hugely what people see. And then we have a few other markets, many of them in Asia, where the biggest access points are aggregators like Yahoo News in Japan or Naver in South Korea. So different platforms. But apart from market differences, we also see extraordinary generational change. And if we're going to just take the UK as an example in terms of, again, this question about direct access, you can see that over 35, so that's the line there, have hardly changed their direct access, and they still have strong connections. This is partly the effect of the BBC. But let's layer onto that the youngest group, 18 to 24s. And you can see how these social natives who grew up with participative social media have increasingly a much weaker connection with those brands, partly because they spend so much time within social networks. So social media and other platforms are becoming more important, but it's not necessarily the same networks, as Elizabeth was pointing out. So this chart shows how Facebook has become much less influential for news. This is aggregated across 12 countries in Europe and other parts of the world. And you can see that 42% said they accessed Facebook for news on a weekly basis in 2016. That's now down to 28%. This is partly Facebook themselves, of course, pulling back from news. And then at the same time, you have some of those other platforms growing. And interesting that the ones that are growing fastest are those video networks. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok becoming more important. It's interesting that despite Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, we don't see a big change yet in terms of weekly overall reach, though many people are reporting much lower engagement, of course, and very few people are moving to those alternatives like Mastodon, according to our data. So those are averages, but let's look again at those 18 to 24s, where we see even more dramatic shifts in terms of the networks that younger people are using around the world. Again, this is based on 12 different countries over time. We've been tracking since 2014. And you can see that decline in Facebook is even greater. You can see the rise of Instagram overtaking Facebook with that group, and then that really dramatic rise of TikTok. So 38% say that they're using TikTok across 12 countries. And this is really affecting the whole strategies of Facebook, pushing more into video, pushing more into creators. And so it's not just TikTok itself, it's the effect it's having elsewhere. If we look across all of the markets we cover, and specifically looking at news and TikTok, TikTok is the fastest growing network. It has the highest usage, not in Western Europe, not in Germany, not in the UK, but in parts of Asia. So look at the figures there for Thailand, Malaysia, Peru, Latin America, Africa, and TikTok has become a really significant player. So it was a significant factor in the Kenyan elections, in the recent Brazilian elections. It spreads misinformation, but also it's being used to generate real change. So a young political party in Thailand has recently become the largest party, partly on the back of a really innovative social media campaign that involved TikTok and YouTube and a range of other networks. So social media matters. But what do we mean when we say people on TikTok or other networks are using those networks for news? Who are they listening to? Who are they paying attention to? Is it journalists? Is it politicians? Is it social media influencers? Or is it ordinary people? So this chart tries to answer that question. And I think it tells a really interesting story. Again, these are averages across all the countries we look at. But the dark blue there, which is mainstream media and journalists, are playing a significant role in Twitter and in Facebook, those traditional social networks. You know, people expect news, they expect journalists to be there leading the conversation, obviously alongside alternative sources and politicians and all the rest of it. But if you look at the networks on the right-hand side, when it comes to Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, much more attention is being paid to personalities, influencers, celebrities, than to journalists, even when it comes to news. And clearly we've seen more media companies piling into TikTok, like DW, for example, but the nature of the platform, the personality-driven nature of it, the culture of it, does make it, I think, more challenging for many mainstream media organizations to know how to engage. The second big issue that's coming out of this year's report, which we also talked about last year, is declining interest in the news in many countries in our survey. You know, not in all countries, but you can see really significant declines, particularly in the last couple of years, especially in countries where politics has become quite polarized. But this is not happening to the same extent everywhere. That's important to stress. So we can see, again, stable in Nordic countries, a little bit less here in Germany, for example. And this is linked to the whole question of news avoidance and news fatigue, we think. Again, we talked a lot about this last year, this idea that people are consuming the news, but they're also avoiding it at the same time, sometimes or often. So across our survey, last year it was 38%, this year it's 36%, so over a third of our samples say they sometimes or often avoid the news. Slightly higher in countries like India, and the UK slightly lower in some of those Nordic countries again. But what we wanted to do this year was to dig down a little bit further into different ways in which people are avoiding the news. So we identified two overlapping groups. So firstly, about half of avoiders saying they're trying to avoid all news. And the kind of behaviors we heard about was people might be listening to the radio and they would switch over when the news came on and then switch back again, or scrolling through social media and scrolling past the news that suddenly come up on their feed to something more interesting and enticing. And there's a strong link with this group with people who have low interest in news and low interest in politics, and we call this periodic avoidance. And then there's a second group who are interested in news, but are taking more specific actions to reduce the amount of news. So that could be, checking the news less often, maybe not in the morning or not in the evening, or cutting out news alerts on their mobile phones, for example, to avoid news that makes them feel anxious or depressed or just difficult news, Ukraine, national politics. And this is linked much more to the sort of feeling that we are overwhelmed by news, and it might bring the mood down. And this is a pretty typical of the kind of comments we had when talking to people in qualitative groups, wanting something lighter, something that makes them feel less anxious. Here's one about politics. The toxic nature of politics and people feeling they have to turn away is pretty typical. So what kind of approaches might help? What kind of news are avoiders more interested in? And our data suggests that over half of those who say they avoid the news sometimes or often say they're interested in more positive news, or journalism that offers solutions, not just problems, that actually tries to take it to that next step. And they're least interested in the type of news that gives constant updates on the biggest stories of the day. And what's really interesting is that's in stark contrast with the people who say they never avoid the news, because they're most interested in those kind of stories, and they're most likely to visit news websites. So perhaps there's something about the one-size-fits-all approach to news which needs to change. We often super-optimize our television channels and our websites for that 10% who are really super interested, and maybe forget about some of the others. And so I think it's a really interesting possibility of how we can change that going forward. Every year we take the temperature on trust in the news, and during COVID we saw a bump in trust as people were looking for reliable news, and over the last couple of years we've seen that come back down again. If we look at the picture by country, we see trust is down in about 15 markets. It's up in 3 and broadly stable in the rest. A lot of variation, as you can see. So highest in Finland, where you have strong trust in institutions as well, and then lowest level this year in Greece. And this is a question, by the way, we ask about the extent to which you trust most news most of the time. I think what's really interesting is that you see that trust does tend to be lower in countries where you have high degrees of political polarization and where media is often really in the eye of the storm. And that's not necessarily about some objective view of quality of those news organizations, but it's people seeing perceptions of things they don't like because they feel so strongly on one side of the argument or another. So to that end, we've looked this year at the link between criticism that people see of journalists and media companies and levels of trust. And as you can see, there's quite a strong correlation between the two. So the higher the level of criticism of the media and of journalists, the lower level of the trust. Though, of course, this is only one factor. Trust is a really complicated issue. When we ask about the sources of that criticism, we find that in many countries, it is politicians and political activists who people say are producing much of that criticism, followed by ordinary people, celebrities, and other journalists. And people are more likely to mention politicians as a source of criticism in the United States as well as the Philippines. And of course, across the world, we see populist politicians regularly denigrating the work of journalists who try to hold them to account. I should also add that we asked another question about what are the channels that you see social media, you see that criticism and social media comes out on top, perhaps not surprisingly. So another reason for low trust, of course, is just the amount of misinformation and disinformation related to the previous point. And this is a question we ask about how concerned you are about what is real and what is fake on the internet when it comes to news. And you can see that we have the highest levels of concern in African countries, the 3 African countries we look at. Again, we find that the concern tends to be highest amongst people who use social media and use social media the most. Turning now to the business of journalism, and it's been a pretty dreadful year in terms of layoffs and closures right around the world, actually. So obviously we've had high-profile BuzzFeed News closing down, Vice filing for bankruptcy, but actually all over the world we've seen layoffs as a result of the economic downturn. And against that background, it's not surprising that publishers are really focusing on diversification and on subscription models and membership models and donation models. And we've been tracking the growth of these kinds of models for several years. So this is the proportion that say they pay for online news through either subscription, membership, or donation. And if we look across 20 countries, we can see a distinct slowing down of growth, and in a few cases, even decline. So a lot of variations, so about a third are paying in some of those countries with those direct connections, like Norway and Sweden. Around a fifth, 21%, pay for some kind of online news in the United States, but much lower in larger markets like Germany and the UK. And as we've heard in this conference, there are very few people paying for news in many parts of the global south. Overall, the average of these countries is unchanged at 17%. And what's interesting, and in many of these countries, we find it's really just a few big quality brands that are taking the biggest slice of the subscription pie. So the New York Times, for example, accounts for more than a third of all subscribers in the United States. But having said that, what's really interesting is in the last few years, we are seeing new models emerging. So a lot of niche subscriptions, a lot of donations, a lot of low-cost models where people maybe are running a newsletter or a podcast and getting people to support that. So I think there's a really interesting sort of split. It's not just about the big players anymore. We're also seeing some new, more interesting models. So just finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about changing formats, and in particular, the greater adoption of digital online audio and video. And to illustrate this, I've gone back to a question that we've asked before about preferences. Do you prefer to read the news when you're online? Do you prefer to listen to the news? Or do you prefer to watch the news? And this is probably the most interesting slide for me in the report, is the differences between countries. So overall, we find that people still prefer to read. 57% say they prefer to read online. That's because online, you want to have control. You want to get to the information really quickly. But 30% say they prefer to watch, and 13% say they prefer to listen, particularly younger users. But then you can see that in Philippines and India, there's very strong preference to watch the news, which is one of the reasons we see so much video news being consumed. Whereas in the United Kingdom and Finland, those preferences are still much more around reading, very strong reading preferences. And that also carries through to differences by age. So this is looking at the same question by age, and you can see that younger people say they're much less likely to prefer to read, they're more likely to watch, and they're more likely to listen. They're much more likely to listen. And this is really what's pushing many publishers to look at podcasts in particular as a way of engaging people and spending time with younger people. You can see the young age profile there. And it's definitely growing, but it's not a mass medium in the same way as radio or television is. If you look at news podcasts, again, this is across 20 countries, only 12% say they're consuming one of those deep dive podcasts or extended chat podcasts. So I think audio still has a long way to go, although there's a lot of supply. And the video change, I think, is really significant. So just a quick recap, and then I'm really interested to take your questions. So firstly, these significant changes, I think, in the platforms people are using for news, driven by younger audiences, turning their attention away from some of those legacy social platforms to some of the next generation ones that really place a premium on entertainment, on personalities, on conversation. And I think that's a challenge for publishers. Secondly, the the depressing nature of the news agenda, the sense that people can't get away from the news, and divisions over politics are all contributing to this sort of low engagement in the news and selective avoidance amongst a significant proportion of the population. And then on the business side, both ad-based and subscription business models are under pressure, and that is compounded by the economic downturn, the cost of living pressures around the world, and in turn, that's making it harder for the media to be truly independent of governments and of powerful businessmen. And then finally, in terms of formats, digital audio video, I think, is going to become a much more important part of the picture over the next 5 years or so, again, driven by those preferences of younger people, and I think video playing an increasingly important role outside Western Europe in much of the global south. So just some of the highlights from our report. You can read more about it using the link on the slide there, and very happy to take any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nic Newman. We're going to stand here in the middle of the floor, and we're going to take a few questions. Max Hoffman, I see you, the head of DW News. He has a few questions for you. Oh, please, just one.
Yes, thank you very much for that study. The question is really your definition of news. How broad is it? You know, would, for example, a piece on analysis that's treating something that happened a week ago qualify as news? Or is it just news as in opposition to entertainment?
It's a great question, one we think about a lot, and it's we give in the survey a definition of news, but I think in qualitative work we do, people have an understanding of the news, which is kind of what they see on televisions or what traditionally they might have seen in a newspaper and the kind of agenda that you might have seen there. And so that would include geopolitics, it would have a bit of sport at the end. But I think what's changed, particularly for young people, is that the definition has got much broader, partly because of the supply of different kinds of news and different kinds of tones and more opinion and all the rest of it. So the way we sort of think about it now is you've got news, and then you've got things that you're passionate about, that you're particularly interested in. And this is where you're seeing many opportunities, I think, to connect with people at a much deeper level through things like podcasts or newsletters or whatever. And then there's just sort of stuff that diverts you and is fun. And for young people, it's very much, traditional media over there, and it's kind of need-to-know stuff, but I'll use them when I need them, but this is the stuff I'm really interested in, I'm going to spend time with. So I think these three different sort of buckets are an interesting way to think about how you engage people going forwards.
Thank you. I'm going to take one question from this side. Yes.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. I just need some clarification. You mentioned that when people are interacting with content on social media, they're more likely to engage with influencers' content than journalist content. So were you referring to the newsroom's official pages on social media, or were you referring to the journalists themselves as influencers? And does that mean that the journalists themselves should become influencers? The second question...
Just one question, please, because we don't have a lot of time. So I'll ask Nic to answer that question about where the attention is. Is it on influencers, is it on the news organization, or on individual journalists?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, limitations of surveys. I think this is a key question, to what extent do journalists still play a role, and who are people paying attention to, and what does an influencer mean? This is really hard, which is why last year we did sort of focus groups as well to try and get to the bottom of it. I think there's just more, the people feel that people paying attention to generally in TikTok and other networks are the people and Instagram, the people they're following in general, and they're increasingly talking about news and politics and gender and a whole load of issues that they care about passionately. So I think that's really fundamentally what's going on, and we saw it with Black Lives Matter, we've seen it with COVID, all kinds of personalities talking about COVID and picking up information in that way. And it was partly because traditional media companies and journalists weren't on TikTok for all kinds of reasons. But I think it's also partly because the nature of it and the way in which you need to connect on these networks are different, and so journalists really struggle with that. So I think this is an evolving picture, and we definitely need to know more.
All right, one final question, the gentleman in front here.
Thank you very much. Konstantin Eget, your former colleague with the BBC, now working for Deutsche Welle on mostly Russian issues. My question is about your terminology. You used the expression traditional media several times. We were told about 5 years ago that traditional media is now gone, traditional media is YouTube. So how, now what we see with the subscription and stuff like that, how is the legacy media, traditional media, whatever you call it, still relevant to the news, and why, by the way? Because it seems we have continuation rather than the rupture. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that a lot of people worry that traditional media is not relevant. It is still relevant, but it's only part of the picture now. So it doesn't, when we look at, the big brands that people pay attention to, particularly when something important happens, when Ukraine was invaded, for example, and we were doing qualitative work at the time, we saw even young people turning on the television for traditional media, and they talk about traditional media. This is language that mainstream media, traditional media is language that young people, old people understand. And they also talk about alternative media, which they use for other purposes. They use them for the passions and to really identify with and get closer to personalities. So I think this idea of sort of traditional, I don't think traditional media is going to go away. It remains important, but young people just don't need it as much as they used to. So they come in for the big stories and then they go back to things that are more diverting.
Thank you, Nic. Unfortunately,